There is a framework for understanding what happened to Nancy Guthrie, and it has been visible since January 11th. The problem is that frameworks only become clear in retrospect, and retrospect is always the most expensive way to achieve clarity in a criminal investigation. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, has been missing from the Tucson, Arizona area since late January 2026. She is without medication her heart requires. Her family measures time in a unit that has no name, but that everyone who has waited for a missing person understands. The stretch between the last time you spoke to someone and the moment you do not know whether they are still alive. That stretch has lasted 3 months. This analysis is about the framework. It is about understanding not just what happened on January 30, but what the evidence from January 11th and the visits investigators believe preceded it tells us about the type of person who did this, the type of planning involved, and the type of evidence that planning inevitably leaves behind. Investigations built on physical evidence and behavioral pattern have a structural advantage that investigations without those foundations do not. The behavioral pattern creates a record. The suspect left that record by returning to Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood multiple times before the night he acted. Each return was a data point. Each data point was a decision. And each decision reflects characteristics of the decision maker that, when read correctly, narrow the field of who this person is and how investigators should be looking for him. The analytical work this report undertakes is the work of reading the pattern correctly. What the surveillance visits mean behaviorally, what the transition from empty hands to weapon and backpack on January 30 means operationally, what the Uber vehicle and the son-in-law's vehicle mean as sources of data, what the camera network along Annie Guthrie's route map means for the question of where he went afterward, and what the fresh federal review of accumulated evidence means for how close this investigation actually is to a resolution that has not yet been publicly confirmed. The framework is there. It has always been there. The work is reading it. The behavioral analysis of a pre-crime surveillance pattern begins with a question that is more important than it might initially seem. Why does someone who has decided to commit a crime go back repeatedly before committing it? The answer reveals the suspect's operational priorities. He is not acting on impulse. He is not reacting to an opportunity. He made a decision, and he is executing against that decision with the discipline to wait until the conditions are exactly right, rather than acting the first time those conditions are approximately right. This behavioral profile is associated with a specific category of offender in the law enforcement analytical literature. The individual who conducts pre-crime surveillance across multiple visits is typically someone who has thought through consequences. He is managing risk. He is not confident in his ability to improvise, or he recognizes that improvisation creates exposure, and he is unwilling to accept that exposure. He wants to know the terrain before he acts on it. He wants to know the resident's routine before he commits to a plan that depends on that routine unfolding in a predictable way. On January 11th, the individual at Nancy Guthrie's door was gathering information. He was confirming what he knew from prior observation and testing what he did not yet know. The fact that he allowed himself to be captured on camera that night without acting suggests two things simultaneously. First, he was confident enough in his concealment, the mask, the darkness, the hours of the night, that being on camera did not represent significant risk to him. Second, he was not yet ready. His operational conditions were not yet established in a way that gave him the confidence to proceed. What changed between January 11th and January 30th was the completion of that readiness. He had watched enough. He knew enough. He was ready in a way he had not been ready on January 11th. And on January 30th, he brought the equipment that expressed that readiness, the weapon, the backpack. He did not arrive at her front door that night to continue his surveillance. He arrived to complete what the surveillance had prepared him to do. The timing of his entry matters analytically. He went back to the front door after the lights were out. He waited until the home appeared quiet and the occupant appeared to be asleep. He had watched that pattern develop across multiple prior visits. He knew the approximate hour at which the lights typically went off. He knew that once they were out, the occupant's alertness and capacity to respond would be diminished. He timed his approach to that specific window. This level of behavioral sophistication is not rare in serious violent crime, but it is notable. It is the difference between a crime of opportunity and a crime of calculation. And crimes of calculation leave more traces, not fewer, because they require more preparation. The preparation involves the prior visits, each of which generated surveillance footage. It involves whatever research was done to identify Nancy Guthrie as a target in the first place, research that likely left digital traces. It involves the planning of an escape route, which the investigation is now attempting to trace through Annie Guthrie's map and the camera network along it. Every element of the preparation is a potential investigative thread. The question is whether investigators have pulled each of those threads with the full force of the resources now being applied to this case. The camera network along the route Annie Guthrie identified deserves the kind of methodical, location-by-location analytical attention that this analysis is going to give it, because the route is not a speculation. It is a theory grounded in knowledge, and theories grounded in knowledge deserve to be tested systematically rather than dismissed intuitively. Begin with what Annie Guthrie actually knows. She lives near her mother. She knows the roads of that community as a resident and as a daughter who has traveled between her own home and her mother's home repeatedly. When she identified a route, she was not guessing from a map she had never traveled. She was applying local geographic knowledge to the question of what path someone leaving her mother's property at a specific time of night, heading in a specific general direction, would most logically take. That local knowledge has evidentiary value. It may not be admissible in court as expert testimony, but in the investigative phase of a case, a daughter's knowledge of her neighborhood is exactly the kind of input that generates productive leads. The history of missing persons cases in which civilian geographic knowledge pointed investigators to evidence they would not otherwise have found is long and documented. Annie Guthrie's route map belongs in that category. The elementary school along the identified route is positioned on what investigators and analysts have characterized as a major thoroughfare, meaning it is a road that carries regular traffic. A road that carries regular traffic is one that a suspect trying to leave a residential area would use to access a larger road network. It is the kind of transition point that makes navigational sense if you are trying to reach a highway or a border route, or any destination outside the immediate neighborhood. The camera coverage at a school building in the current era is extensive. Modern school security installs cameras at all points of access and at the perimeter of the building with fields of view that are designed to overlap so that a person or vehicle approaching from any direction is captured by at least one camera and typically more than one. The footage from those cameras does not expire at the end of the school day. It is recorded continuously. And in the context of an investigation that is now being reviewed by federal resources with the technical capacity to enhance, analyze, and compare footage across multiple sources, the school cameras represent one of the strongest potential evidence points along the identified route. The nail salon with an exterior camera facing the road presents a different but equally valuable opportunity. This is private commercial security footage rather than institutional school security footage. Its quality and coverage may differ, but its fundamental value is the same. It records the road in front of the business at all hours. At 2 or 3 in the morning on the night of the abduction, the volume of traffic on that road would be minimal. Every vehicle on the road at that hour is exceptional. Every exceptional vehicle on the road at that hour, captured on any camera in the area, is a potential lead. The recently renovated commercial property along the route is analytically interesting for a specific reason. Renovation of a commercial space means new security infrastructure, new cameras, newly installed and freshly calibrated, covering the property and its perimeter. Renovation projects typically install camera systems late in the construction process, just before the space reopens. The question of whether those cameras were operational on the night in question depends on when the renovation reached the stage of operational security infrastructure. If they were, the footage they captured would be pristine, newly recorded onto systems that had not yet accumulated months of overwrites. The intersections along the route are the analytically simplest, but practically most powerful camera positions. At any point where a vehicle must slow or stop, every camera in the area has an extended window to capture that vehicle. A vehicle at a stop sign sits still for a number of seconds. A camera with a clear view of a stop sign captures every vehicle that stops at it. In the early morning hours when traffic is minimal, a license plate captured at a stop sign along a residential thoroughfare is not one of dozens. It is one of a few. It is identifiable and traceable. The vehicle spotted 2.5 miles from the home on a Ring camera, dismissed early in the investigation, sits within the geographic corridor that Annie Guthrie's route map defines. That is not a coincidence to be ignored. It is a convergence to be pursued. Even if that specific vehicle turns out to be unrelated, the analytical principle it represents is correct. The corridor Annie Guthrie identified is the right corridor to search, and everything within it deserves investigation. Subscribe so you are here when the footage that confirms or refines this analysis becomes public. The camera network exists. The evidence is in it. The federal review is going through it right now. The staged crime scene theory that has been advanced by a forensic psychologist requires analytical engagement. Because in a case of this complexity and visibility, every serious theory deserves serious evaluation against the evidence. The theory is that Nancy Guthrie was harmed or killed at a location other than her home, and that the scene at her home was subsequently arranged to create a false impression of where the crime occurred. The motive for such staging would be to misdirect the initial investigation toward the home as the site of the crime, potentially away from another location where the actual crime was committed and which, if investigators focused on it, would provide more direct evidence. Applied to the Nancy Guthrie case, the analytical test of this theory is straightforward. Does the physical evidence at the scene support the conclusion that she was present there in the circumstances the scene depicts? Or does it contain characteristics inconsistent with her actual presence? The biological material at the scene, specifically the blood distribution pattern observed at the front of the property, contains characteristics that forensic analysis has found to be inconsistent with artificial deposition. The distribution of large drops and satellite droplets, the physical pattern of how the blood came to rest on the surface, reflects the physics of biological material expelled under force from the nose or mouth of a person present at that location at that moment. Recreating that pattern artificially would require the artificial simulation of a specific biological event, including the replication of its directional and gravitational characteristics at a level of forensic sophistication that is not consistent with the behavioral profile of the suspect as visible in the footage. Additionally, her pacemaker placed her at the scene that night. Medical devices that monitor cardiac activity create a time-stamped record of their location and the physiological events they record. A pacemaker does not generate data that places its wearer at a location unless the wearer was at that location. That data places Nancy Guthrie at her home on the night of the abduction. Her personal belongings, including her walker, her glasses, her phone, and her shoes, were at the scene. The arrangement of those belongings is consistent with a person who was at the property, who was preparing for sleep, and who was interrupted before completing that preparation. The stage scene theory, when evaluated against this evidence baseline, does not hold. The physical evidence is internally consistent in a way that staging would struggle to replicate. The biological material at the scene is consistent with an event that occurred there. The medical device data places her there. The personal belongings are arranged in the pattern of interrupted normalcy rather than deliberate staging. What the stage scene theory does, however, is valuable in a different way. It is a challenge to the investigation's foundational assumptions about where the crime began. That challenge, when measured against the evidence and found wanting, strengthens the investigation's confidence in those assumptions. An investigation that has tested its foundational premises against alternative theories is more robust than one that is not. The forensic and medical evidence withstand the test. The situation surrounding the sheriff leading the local investigation is a separate analytical concern with its own implications for the case's future. A 10-day deadline to respond formally to questions about his conduct was not met in the way required. What was submitted was unsworn. The oversight body is now determining how to proceed. Legal analysts and former investigators who have addressed this scenario consistently raise the same question. If the lead local investigator's conduct becomes a formal legal issue, what is the impact on the evidentiary foundation of any future prosecution? The answer is that defense counsel in a future prosecution will examine the investigative record for any decisions made under compromised leadership that affected the collection, preservation, or analysis of evidence. If any such decisions can be identified, they become points of challenge at trial. The FBI's involvement provides a structural buffer against this risk. Federal investigators operate independently of the local chain of command. Their evidence collection, documentation, and analytical work is conducted under a separate institutional framework with its own accountability standards. Whatever happens to the local investigation's leadership, the federal record of what has been collected and how it was collected remains intact and legally insulated from local institutional instability. That insulation is one of the significant practical benefits of federal involvement in a case where local leadership is under formal scrutiny. The analytical synthesis of 3 months of evidence in the Nancy Guthrie case produces a conclusion that is more specific than the daily headlines of this investigation might suggest. This is not a case that has gone cold. It is a case that has accumulated a substantial evidentiary record and is now in the process of having that record reviewed with fresh perspective and federal resources. The behavioral record of the suspect is clear. He surveilled before he acted. He learned before he moved. He arrived on January 30th prepared in a way that his prior visits were not. That preparation reflects a decision made in advance and executed with discipline. It also reflects a digital and physical trail. Whatever research he did to identify Nancy Guthrie as a target left traces in the forms that research always leaves. Whatever route he took to reach the neighborhood and to leave it after the abduction is recorded at least partially in the surveillance camera infrastructure of Tucson's residential and commercial areas. The route Annie Guthrie identified is the most direct publicly available guide to where that recording might be found. Cameras at an elementary school, a nail salon exterior, a recently renovated commercial property, multiple intersections where any vehicle must decelerate, a vehicle caught on a Ring camera 2.5 miles from the home that falls within the corridor the route map defines. Each of these is a location where footage either exists and is relevant or existed and was overwritten before investigators reached it. The fresh federal review is the systematic examination of what remains. The vehicle data from the Uber and from the son-in-law's car creates a precise timestamp and location record for the specific window during which the abduction occurred. That window is the filter through which all other footage in the area can be analyzed. Every camera that recorded during that window is a potential source of the vehicle evidence that has not yet been publicly confirmed. The forensic evidence from inside the home, the hair potentially identified as critical, the biological material being processed, the DNA from home help being compared. All of this is moving through a laboratory process that is methodical and that produces conclusions that cannot be influenced by the institutional pressures, the reward incentives, or the public attention that surrounds this case on the outside. The laboratory works at its own pace and delivers its results when the analysis is complete. When those results are ready, they will either eliminate profiles or confirm one. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is without the medication her heart requires. She has been missing for 3 months. Her family lives in agony. Her community lives in fear. The person responsible for this has been careful. He planned. He executed. He left fewer obvious traces than less careful perpetrators do, but he left traces. The pre-crime surveillance visits left camera footage. The night of the abduction left biological material. The escape route left a trail that a route map identifies and a camera network partially records. The research that identified Nancy Guthrie as a target left digital footprints. The analytical conclusion is that this case has the evidentiary foundation to be resolved. It has federal resources now applied to its fresh review. It has a community and family that have sustained the pressure and attention that keep investigations from losing institutional priority. It has a reward structure that creates financial incentive for anyone with information to come forward. And it has the behavioral record of a suspect who is careful but not invisible, who planned but left traces of the planning, and who committed a crime that the physical evidence of the scene, the laboratory, and the camera network of a city are collectively in the process of documenting. The framework has been there since January 11. It is being read more completely every day. The answer at the end of it is waiting for the right question to bring it into focus. The fresh federal review may be the point at which that question is finally asked. The Nancy Guthrie investigation will be studied by law enforcement educators and criminologists for what it demonstrates about the consequences of institutional miscommunication and leadership instability in a high-visibility case. The specific failures that have been identified and criticized publicly are not trivial. A sheriff who made public statements that contradicted each other, that contradicted the physical evidence, and that contradicted the assessments of experienced investigators, created a communication environment around this case that generated confusion rather than clarity. When a law enforcement leader says, in the context of an active investigation with physical evidence of a violent abduction, that his guess is as good as anyone else's, he is not managing expectations. He is undermining the institutional credibility of the investigation in a way that has consequences. Those consequences are felt in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The public who is watching and who contains individuals with potentially relevant information forms an impression of the investigation's competence and direction based on what they hear from its institutional leadership. An investigation that communicates uncertainty and contradiction does not inspire the kind of confidence that motivates a witness to come forward. A witness who might otherwise think that what they saw on a residential street at 2 a.m. was probably relevant has that intuition reinforced or undermined by their perception of whether the investigation is capable of using what they know. The community in which the crime occurred, whose sustained attention and watchfulness is itself an investigative resource, forms an assessment of the investigation's direction based on what it hears from official sources. A community that hears its sheriff making statements that experienced analysts characterize as inconsistent with the physical evidence is a community that is less certain about whether the investigation is being conducted in a way that will produce accountability. The formal accountability process that the sheriff now faces, the deadline that passed without sworn compliance, the oversight body now weighing formal proceedings, creates a legal vulnerability in the investigative record that defense counsel in any future prosecution will examine carefully. Every decision made by the investigation's leadership during the period of formal institutional instability is a potential point of challenge. Was evidence preserved correctly? Were search warrants obtained appropriately? Were investigative resources allocated in a way that reflects genuine prioritization of the evidence rather than external pressure management? These questions do not have publicly confirmed answers, but they are questions that will be asked if this case reaches a prosecution. And they are questions that the fresh federal review must address through its own documentation of how the evidence has been handled. The broader analytical lesson, the one that will be taught in forensic and investigative programs using this case as an example, is that institutional communication in a high visibility investigation is not a peripheral concern. It is central. The words that a lead investigator uses to describe a case to the public are not merely public relations. They are the frame through which every potential witness, every potential tipster, every community member with a relevant observation evaluates whether they should come forward and whether what they have to offer is valuable. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that frame has not always served the investigation. The fresh federal involvement is, in part, a correction of the institutional communication failure as much as it is an investigative one. 3 months is a specific kind of time in criminal investigations. It is long enough for physical evidence to degrade, for witnesses' memories to be less reliable than they were in the first days, for surveillance footage to be overwritten by the recording cycles of commercial security systems, and for potential suspects to alter their circumstances in ways that make them harder to trace. But it is also long enough for investigators to have assembled a comprehensive picture of the relevant evidence landscape and to know with precision what they have and what they still need. The accumulation of 3 months of investigative work produces a record that is deeper and more interconnected than what exists at the end of the first week. Subpoenas that were served in February have produced records by now. Laboratory analysis that was initiated in the first days has progressed to the point where results are available or imminent. Witnesses who were interviewed in the first days have been re-interviewed in the context of evidence that was not available during those initial conversations. The investigation has had time to find the connections between its individual evidence elements that are not visible when each element is new and the context for it is not yet established. The fresh federal review of all of this accumulated, interconnected evidence is not starting from the beginning. It is starting from the accumulated record with the advantage of perspective. 3 months of work has produced a structure. The fresh review is examining that structure for the element that connects the remaining unknown to the known elements in a way that points definitively to an identification. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that connecting element is most likely a vehicle. The physical evidence places a specific person at her home on a specific night. The behavioral evidence places that same person at her home on multiple prior nights. The forensic evidence is building a biological profile of that person. What is missing is the vehicle that transported him to and from the neighborhood, the route he used, and the footage that captures that route. The route map and the camera network are the most specific, publicly available guides to where that footage might be found. The fresh federal review is the mechanism by which those guides are being followed. 3 months in, the investigation knows what it has and it knows what it needs. The gap between those two things is narrower than it has ever been.